The rain hammered against the windows of the underground clinic like bullets against steel. It was 3 in the morning in Brooklyn, and the streets were empty except for the shadows that moved with purpose through the darkness. Dr. Adrian Cole stood in his operating room, scrubbing blood from beneath his fingernails, blood that didn't belong to him, but to men whose names he never asked and whose faces he tried to forget. Adrian was 38 years old, with steel-grey eyes that had seen too much and hands that had saved too many lives that probably didn't deserve saving. He wasn't always this way. Once he'd been a promising surgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital, with a future as bright as the Manhattan skyline. But that was before his younger brother got involved with the wrong people, before the debts piled up, before Adrian made a deal with the devil to keep his family alive. Now he was known only as the healer, a ghost in the criminal underworld, the man you called when a bullet needed extracting and no questions could be asked. His clinic was hidden beneath a legitimate medical supply warehouse in Red Hook, accessible only through a rusted freight elevator that descended into what felt like another world entirely. The walls were lined with medical equipment that would make any hospital jealous, all of it acquired through channels that existed in the margins of legality. Adrian lived by 3 rules that kept him alive: never ask names, never keep records, and never ever care about the people on his table. They were bodies, problems to solve, wounds to close. Caring meant attachment, and attachment in this world meant death. The night Isabella Romano entered his life, those rules would become nothing more than ash. It started with a phone call at 2:47 a.m. The voice on the other end was panicked, breathing hard. "We're coming in hot, Doc. Gunshot wound, female, mid-20s. She's losing a lot of blood." The line went dead before Adrian could respond, but he was already moving, already preparing. This was the dance he knew by heart, the sudden emergency, the race against death, the clinical detachment that kept his hands steady. 15 minutes later, the freight elevator groaned to life. Adrian heard the commotion before he saw it. Men shouting, heavy footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone struggling to breathe. Then they burst through the doors, 3 men in dark suits carrying a woman between them like a broken doll. She was unconscious, her face pale as moonlight, her designer dress soaked crimson from a wound in her left side. Dark hair spilled across her face, and even in her current state, there was something striking about her, an elegance that seemed out of place in this basement of blood and secrets. "Put her on the table," Adrian commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The men obeyed without hesitation. As they laid her down under the harsh surgical lights, Adrian got his first real look at her face, and something inside him shifted, a crack in the armor he'd spent years building. She couldn't have been older than 26, with delicate features that spoke of privilege and protection, yet here she was, bleeding out in an illegal clinic. Her lips were slightly parted, struggling for air, and there was a small scar above her right eyebrow that suggested this wasn't her first brush with violence. "What happened?" Adrian asked, as he cut away her dress to expose the wound. It was a through-and-through gunshot wound, just below her ribcage. The exit wound was larger, more ragged. She was lucky, if you could call any of this luck. A few inches higher, and she'd already be dead. One of the men, the oldest, with silver threading through his dark hair, stepped forward. "Wrong place, wrong time. That's all you need to know, Doc." His accent was thick, definitely Brooklyn Italian, and his eyes held a warning that Adrian recognized immediately. "Don't ask questions you don't want answered." Adrian didn't respond. He was already working, his hands moving with practiced precision as he assessed the damage. The bullet had missed major organs, but she'd lost a significant amount of blood. He started an IV line, pushed fluids, began the delicate work of cleaning and closing the wound. As he worked, he became aware of something unusual. The men hadn't left. Typically, they dropped off their cargo and disappeared, trusting him to do his job. But these 3 stood watching, their tension filling the room like a physical presence. The silver-haired man kept glancing at his phone, his jaw tight with an emotion Adrian couldn't quite read. Fear, perhaps, or anger barely contained. She gonna make it? The other man finally asked, and there was something raw in his voice that made Adrian look up. If I do my job right, yes, Adrian replied, returning his attention to the woman on his table. But she needs rest, monitoring. She can't be moved for at least 48 hours. The men exchanged glances. The silver-haired one shook his head. Not possible. We need to move her tonight. Then you'll be moving a corpse, Adrian said flatly. Her body's in shock. Move her now and she'll hemorrhage internally. I can't save her if you won't let me do this right. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats and calculations. Finally, the silver-haired man nodded. 48 hours, not a minute more. And Doc? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Nobody can know she's here. Nobody. You understand? This girl. She's worth more dead than alive to a lot of people right now. Adrian understood more than he wanted to. This wasn't just another mobster's daughter caught in crossfire. This was something bigger, more dangerous. He should have refused right then, should have kicked them out and washed his hands of whatever political nightmare this represented. But as he looked down at her face, peaceful now in unconsciousness, he found he couldn't form the words. The men left shortly after, disappearing back into the night from which they'd come. Adrian was alone with his patient, with the steady beep of the heart monitor and the sound of rain against distant windows. He finished closing her wounds with meticulous care, his sutures small and precise. When he was done, he found himself doing something he never did. He pulled up a chair beside the operating table and simply sat, watching her breathe. In the harsh light, he could see more details. A small tattoo on her inner wrist, a rose with thorns, expensive jewelry that suggested wealth and status, hands that were soft but showed signs of recent defensive wounds. She'd fought back against whoever shot her. Who was she? The question formed in his mind, despite his better judgment. Isabella, one of the men, had called her when they thought he wasn't listening. Isabella Romano. The name triggered something in his memory. Newspaper articles, whispered conversations in the underworld. The Romanos were one of New York's oldest crime families, currently locked in a bitter territory war with the Castellanos. If she was a Romano and she'd been shot, Adrian stood abruptly, as if distance could protect him from the implications. This was exactly why he didn't ask questions, didn't learn names. Knowledge was danger, and he'd just been handed enough knowledge to get him killed a dozen times over. He should call them back, tell them to move her regardless of the risks. He should walk away from this before he got pulled into something that would destroy everything he'd built. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound, soft, barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. She was dreaming, murmuring words he couldn't make out. Her hand moved slightly, reaching for something that wasn't there. Without thinking, Adrian moved back to her side and gently took her hand in his. It was cold, her fingers delicate against his calloused palm. "You're safe," he heard himself whisper, words he'd never spoken to a patient before. "I've got you." Her breathing steadied at his touch, the tension leaving her face. Adrian stood there, holding the hand of a woman whose name he shouldn't know, whose life he'd just saved, whose presence in his clinic represented everything he'd tried to avoid for the last 10 years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean of sins that would be committed again tomorrow. And in the underground clinic, Dr. Adrian Cole made a decision that would change everything. He would keep her safe, just for 48 hours, just until she was strong enough to leave. Then his life could return to normal. He had no idea how wrong he was. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Adrian finally left her side to catch a few hours of sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. He kept seeing her face, kept feeling the cold touch of her hand, kept wondering what kind of life had led someone so young to end up bleeding on his table. The healer had saved hundreds of lives, but he'd never once wondered about them after. Now, as exhaustion finally pulled him under, his last thought was a question that would haunt him. What made Isabella Romano different? Adrian woke 6 hours later to the sound of movement in the clinic. His heart hammered as he bolted upright, reaching for the gun he kept in his nightstand, a precaution he'd hoped never to use. But as he emerged from his small living quarters attached to the clinic, he realized the sound wasn't an intruder. It was her. Isabella Romano was awake, sitting up on the operating table with one hand pressed against her bandaged side, the other gripping the edge of the table as if the room were spinning. Her dark eyes were wide with confusion and pain, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with the cautious awareness of someone accustomed to danger. "Don't move," Adrian said, keeping his voice calm as he approached. "You've been shot. You're in a safe place, but you need to stay still or you'll tear your sutures." She turned those dark eyes on him, and Adrian felt the impact of her gaze like a physical thing. Up close, conscious, she was even more striking than he'd realized. There was intelligence in her expression, a sharpness that suggested a mind constantly calculating angles and exits. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse from intubation, but there was steel underneath. "And who are you?" "Somewhere safe," Adrian replied, maintaining professional distance as he checked her vitals. "I'm the doctor who kept you from bleeding out. Now lie back down before you undo all my work." She didn't obey immediately. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see through the walls he'd built around himself. "You're the healer," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I've heard about you. The ghost surgeon who works for anyone who can pay." "Then you know I don't answer questions," Adrian said, gently but firmly guiding her back down. Her skin was warm now, no longer cold with shock, and he told himself the quickening of his pulse was just relief at her recovery. "And neither should you. Rest is what you need, not conversation." But Isabella Romano, he was learning, wasn't someone who followed orders easily. "How long have I been here?" she asked, wincing as she settled against the thin pillow. 14 hours. "You have 34 more before your people come back for you." Adrian busied himself checking her IV line, adjusting her pain medication. "Try to make the most of them by not talking and not moving." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone like sunlight through clouds. 34 hours, that's specific. Someone must have put the fear of God into you about keeping me here. "Indeed, something like that," Adrian muttered. He wasn't about to tell her that he'd spent the last 6 hours doing something he'd sworn never to do, researching his patient. The internet had provided plenty of information about Isabella Romano, none of it comforting. She was 27, the only daughter of Vincent Romano, one of New York's most powerful crime bosses. But unlike her brothers, who'd followed their father into the family business, Isabella had tried to build a different life. She'd gone to Columbia, studied art history, ran a legitimate gallery in Soho. The newspapers painted her as the princess trying to escape the castle, the Mafia daughter who wanted to be clean, but the photos told a different story. In every picture, despite the elegant dresses and cultured surroundings, there was something watchful in her eyes, a wariness that spoke of a woman who knew exactly what darkness lurked in her world. She might have wanted out, but she'd never been free. "You're different from what I expected," Isabella said, pulling him from his thoughts. When he looked at her questioningly, she continued, "The healer. I imagined someone colder, more clinical. But you held my hand while I was unconscious. I remember that." Adrian felt heat rise in his face, a reaction he hadn't experienced in years. "You were in distress. It's standard procedure to provide comfort to unconscious patients." "Is it standard procedure to whisper that I'm safe?" "Udi," she asked softly, and there was something knowing in her eyes that made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly paper-thin. He turned away, busying himself with equipment that didn't need adjusting. "You should eat something. Keep your strength up." The next 30 hours unfolded in a way Adrian had never experienced before. He'd treated hundreds of patients in this clinic, yet he'd never actually spent time with any of them, never had conversations that lasted beyond medical necessity. But with Isabella, Trapped together in his underground sanctuary, walls began to crumble despite his best efforts to maintain them. She told him about her gallery, about finding beauty in art when her real life offered so little. She spoke about growing up in a world where violence was currency and loyalty was everything, where she'd watched her mother wither under the weight of loving a man who dealt in death. She talked about her failed attempts to separate herself from her family's legacy, how every step toward freedom only tightened the chains. And despite himself, Adrian found himself talking too. He told her about his brother, about the impossible choice that had led him here. He spoke about the ghosts that haunted him, the lives he'd saved that had gone on to take other lives, the moral calculus that kept him awake at night. With every word, he felt himself becoming more exposed, more vulnerable. On the second night, as she sat up in bed eating the soup he'd made, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Why did they shoot me? Adrian had been wondering the same thing. From what he'd gathered, she wasn't actively involved in her family's operations. She was the protected daughter, the one kept clean. I don't know, he admitted. Your father's men didn't share details. My father, she repeated, and something dark passed across her face. He didn't send those men to save me, Adrian. He sent them to hide me. It was the first time she'd used his name, and hearing it from her lips did something to him that he couldn't quite define. What do you mean? She set down the soup, her movements careful around her injury. There's going to be a war. A real one this time, not just skirmishes over territory. The Castellanos, they're making a move against my family. They needed leverage, something to force my father's hand. So they came for me. And your father's response is to hide you? Adrian asked, though pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. My father's response, Isabella said quietly, is to make it look like I'm already dead. If the Castellanos think they've already lost their leverage, they'll move forward with their plan, and my father will be ready for them. So, those men who brought you here were told to make sure I disappeared. Whether I lived or died was probably up to you. She met his eyes, and he saw the truth in them. The acceptance of someone who'd always known her life was a bargaining chip in someone else's game. You saved my life, Adrian, but you might have only delayed the inevitable. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Adrian wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her father wouldn't sacrifice his own daughter. But they both knew the world they lived in, the calculations that men like Vincent Romano made every day. Then we make sure it's not inevitable, Adrian heard himself say, and the words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised her. We, she asked, a dangerous hope creeping into her voice. Adrian stood, began to pace. This was insane. This was everything he'd spent a decade avoiding. You can't go back. You know that, right? The moment you surface, you're either a target for the Castellanos or a liability to your father. I know, she whispered, and I can't keep you here. This clinic, my arrangement with the families, it all depends on neutrality. The second they know I've chosen a side. I know, she said again, but now she was looking at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. So, why are you even suggesting there's a we in this equation? It was a fair question, one Adrian wasn't sure he could answer rationally. He'd spent 10 years not caring, not getting involved beyond the mechanical act of saving lives. He'd built a reputation on his complete lack of emotional investment. But now, looking at this woman who'd been shot and abandoned, who faced death with a dignity that broke his heart, he found that all his carefully maintained distance had evaporated. Because, he said finally, moving back to her bedside, for the first time in a very long time, I actually care whether someone lives or dies. The words fell between them like a confession, raw and honest, in a way Adrian hadn't been with anyone in years. Isabella reached out, her fingers barely brushing his hand, and the simple touch sent electricity through him. That's dangerous, she whispered. Caring about me might be the thing that gets you killed. I know, He echoed her earlier words, and despite everything, the danger, the impossibility, the certain doom this represented, he found himself smiling. "I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to know better." They sat in silence for a long moment, hands just barely touching, both of them aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Outside, the city moved through its rhythms of day and night, unaware that in a basement in Brooklyn, two people were making decisions that would ripple out into the darkness. When the phone rang at 11 p.m., 13 hours before the 48-hour deadline, Adrian knew before answering that everything had just gotten worse. The voice on the other end was Vincent Romano himself, and his words were ice. "Change of plans, Doc. Don't wait for us to pick her up. Take care of the problem tonight, permanently." The line went dead before Adrian could respond. He stood frozen, phone in hand, Isabella watching him with eyes that already knew what he'd been told. "How long do we have?" she asked calmly. "They'll come to verify within hours," Adrian said, his mind already racing through possibilities, calculating angles. "We need to move, now." What happened next was a blur of activity. Adrian had always maintained an exit strategy. Multiple identities, cash reserves, a car registered under a false name. In his line of work, you didn't survive without contingency plans. He'd just never imagined he'd be using them. He helped Isabella dress in spare clothes he kept for emergencies, trying not to notice how vulnerable she looked, how the simple act of standing made her wince with pain. She was still recovering, still weak from blood loss, but they had no choice. Stay meant death for both of them. As they prepared to leave, Isabella suddenly grabbed his arm. "Adrian, wait. There's something you need to know. We don't have time." "Make time," she insisted, her grip surprisingly strong. "If we're doing this, if you're really throwing away your entire life for me, you deserve to know the truth." Something in her voice made Adrian stop, made him look at her fully. "What truth?" "The shooting wasn't random," she said, words tumbling out in a rush now. "And it wasn't the Castellanos. It was my own family, my father. He ordered it. I found out about his plan to start the war, about innocent people he was going to sacrifice. I tried to stop it, tried to go to someone who could intervene. He found out, so he decided I was a liability." The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. He'd assumed she was caught in crossfire, a victim of circumstances. But this was something else entirely. "You're saying your own father tried to have you killed?" "Welcome to my world," she said bitterly, "where even blood is negotiable if it threatens business." She searched his face, looking for disgust or judgment. "So now you know. I'm not just a damsel in distress. I'm a traitor to my own family, marked for death by my own father." "Last chance to walk away, Doctor." Adrian should have walked away. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was suicide, that getting between Isabella and her father's wrath was certain death. But as he looked at her, this woman who'd tried to do the right thing in a world of wrong, who faced her own execution with her head held high, he realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. For 10 years he'd saved lives without caring about them, had been complicit in violence by cleaning up its aftermath. He'd told himself he was neutral, that he was just a doctor doing his job. But neutrality in the face of evil was just cowardice with a fancy name. "Let's go," he said, taking her hand and heading for the exit. "We've both been dead inside for too long. Might as well try being alive together." They emerged from the clinic into a Brooklyn night that smelled of rain and possibility. Adrian had one advantage. He knew the underground of this city better than most, knew the places where people could disappear. He had a safe house in Queens, a place he'd prepared for exactly this kind of emergency, never really believing he'd need it. As they drove through empty streets, Isabella's hand in his, Adrian realized with startling clarity that he'd just done something irreversible. He'd chosen a side. He'd cared. And whether they survived the next few days or not, he was already a different man than he'd been 48 hours ago. The healer was dead. What would rise from the ashes remained to be seen. The safe house in Queens was nothing special. a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where people minded their own business. Adrian had purchased it years ago under one of his false identities, a bolt hole he'd never expected to use. Now, as dawn broke over the city, he helped Isabella up the narrow stairs. Her breathing labored but steady. Inside, the apartment was sparse but functional. Medical supplies he'd stashed over the years filled one closet. Cash and new identities were hidden in a floor safe. It was the kind of place designed for temporary survival, not living, but it was off the grid, and right now, that was all that mattered. "Sit," Adrian ordered, guiding Isabella to the worn couch. She'd been strong during the escape, but now he could see the toll it had taken. Pain etched lines around her eyes, and fresh blood spotted her bandages. "You've torn your sutures. Let me fix them." As he worked, cleaning and restitching with practiced efficiency, his mind raced through their options. They had maybe 24 hours before Vincent Romano realized his daughter was truly gone, not dead, but escaped. After that, every resource of one of New York's most powerful crime families would be hunting them. "We need to leave the city," Adrian said, securing the last suture. "I have contacts in Boston, people who can help us disappear." "Running," Isabella said softly. "Is that the plan? Run forever, looking over our shoulders, waiting for the day they find us?" "You have a better idea?" Adrian asked, though he already knew that running left a bitter taste in his mouth too. He'd spent 10 years running from who he'd been, and it had turned him into a ghost. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes fixed on something distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm with a decision already made. "What if instead of running from the monster we cut off its head?" Adrian stared at her. "You can't mean—" "My father needs to be stopped," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not just for us, but for everyone caught in his wars. The innocent people who'll die in the conflict he's planning. The families that will be destroyed. Someone has to stop him, Adrian. Why not the daughter he tried to kill?" It was insane. Suicidal. Everything Adrian had learned about survival said they should run as far and fast as possible. But as he looked at Isabella, saw the fire in her eyes despite her pain, he understood something crucial about her. She'd tried running her whole life, running from her father's world, from her family's legacy. It had never worked because you couldn't run from something that was part of your DNA. "How?" he asked, and with that single word, he committed to madness. Over the next hours, Isabella laid out a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Her father's power came from secrecy, from the careful separation between his legitimate business empire and his criminal operations. But Isabella knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. She had access to files, recordings, evidence that could bring down not just Vincent Romano, but half the corrupt officials in New York who protected him. "I've been collecting it for years," she admitted. "Every time I tried to leave, every time I thought I could be free, I'd document something else. Insurance, I told myself, a way to protect myself if it ever came to this. I never thought I'd actually use it." "Where is this evidence?" Adrian asked. "Safe deposit box, Manhattan Trust Bank, under a false identity even my father doesn't know about." She paused, wincing as she shifted position. "But there's a problem. The box requires both a key and a biometric scan. My thumbprint. I can't just send someone to get it. So we need to get you into a bank in the middle of Manhattan, while every criminal in New York is looking for you," Adrian said flatly. "That's not a plan, that's suicide." "Do you have a better idea?" she challenged, echoing his earlier words back at him. He didn't. And more than that, he understood why this mattered to her. Isabella had spent her life as a pawn in her father's games, always reactive, always running. This was her chance to take control, to be the one making moves instead of being moved. "We'll need help," Adrian said finally, "the kind of help that's going to cost us everything we have." That was how Adrian found himself making a call he'd sworn never to make, to a man he'd hoped never to contact again. Marcus Chen answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. I told you never to call this number unless the world was ending. It is, Adrian said simply. I need the kind of help only you can provide. Marcus Chen was a ghost in the underworld, a fixer who specialized in the impossible. Adrian had saved his life once, years ago, and Marcus owed him a debt. Now was the time to collect. They met at a Chinese restaurant in Flushing that night, in a private room where Marcus listened to Adrian's plan with an expression that cycled from disbelief to admiration to resignation. When Adrian finished, Marcus leaned back and laughed, a sound without humor. You're asking me to help you infiltrate a bank, steal evidence from a woman who's supposed to be dead, and take down Vincent Romano, all while half the city's looking for you. Marcus shook his head. You know what? I've lived too long anyway. Let's do it. The next 72 hours were a blur of preparation. Marcus assembled a small team, people he trusted, specialists in various forms of legal and illegal expertise, a hacker who could manipulate security systems, a makeup artist who could transform Isabella into someone unrecognizable, a getaway driver who knew every backstreet in Manhattan. Adrian found himself in a world he'd only glimpsed from the shadows, the active side of criminality rather than just cleaning up its aftermath. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and through it all, Isabella was his anchor. Despite her injury, despite the danger, she never wavered in her determination. On the fourth night in the safe house, as they reviewed the plan for the 100th time, Isabella suddenly set down her papers and looked at Adrian with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Really? Don't give me the noble answer. Tell me the truth." Adrian could have deflected, could have hidden behind altruism or logic. But after everything they'd been through, she deserved honesty. "Because you made me remember what it feels like to be alive," he said. "For 10 years, I've just been going through motions, saving lives without caring if they lived or died. I told myself I was being professional, neutral, but I was just dead inside. And then you showed up, bleeding and broken, and something in me woke up." He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You asked me once why I held your hand when you were unconscious. The truth is, I needed to know you were real, that it was possible for someone to still have hope in this world. You're not my patient anymore, Isabella. You're the reason I remember why I became a doctor in the first place, to save lives that matter." The space between them dissolved. Isabella reached up, her hand cupping his face, and when she kissed him, it was like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then deepened into something that spoke of desperation and hope, and the desperate grab for life in the face of almost certain death. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Isabella rested her forehead against his. "If we die doing this, then we die alive," Adrian finished. "Better than the alternative." The day of the operation dawned grey and cold, the kind of February morning where the city felt held in suspension between winter and spring. Isabella looked like a different person. Darker hair, colored contacts, makeup that changed the shape of her face. She wore an expensive business suit that signaled wealth and authority, the kind of person banks didn't question. Adrian watched from a cafe across the street, a comm unit hidden in his ear connecting him to Marcus's team. Isabella entered the bank at precisely 10 a.m., her movements confident, despite the healing wound in her side. "She's in," Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Security cameras are on a loop. We've got a 15-minute window." Adrian watched as Isabella approached the safe deposit area. From his vantage point, he could see her produce the key, place her thumb on the scanner. There was a moment, a terrible, stretched moment, where he thought the disguise wouldn't work, that the scanner would reject her altered thumbprint. Then the light turned green. "She's in the vault," Marcus confirmed. Starting the clock. 14 minutes. Those 14 minutes felt like 14 hours. Adrian forced himself to breathe normally, to sip his coffee, to look like just another businessman taking a break. but his entire body was tense, ready to move if anything went wrong. 12 minutes. 11. Where was she? We've got a problem. Marcus's voice suddenly cut through, urgent. 2 men just entered the bank. Romano's men. Someone tipped them off. Adrian's blood turned to ice. He was already standing, already moving toward the door, when Marcus continued, "No, wait. Stay where you are. If you go in now, you'll blow everything. She's still got time." It was the hardest thing Adrian had ever done, staying still when every instinct screamed to move, to protect, to fight. His hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to hurt, his eyes locked on the bank entrance. 9 minutes. 8. "They're heading to the vault level," Marcus said, and Adrian heard the controlled panic in his voice. "She's got maybe 2 minutes before they reach her." Then, impossibly, Isabella emerged from the vault area, a large envelope under her arm, her movements unhurried despite the danger closing in. She walked through the main lobby just as Romano's men descended the stairs to the vault level, missing her by seconds. She exited the bank, turned left, and disappeared into the morning crowd. "I've got her!" The getaway driver's voice came through the comm. "Clean extraction. We're clear." Adrian sagged with relief, so profound it made him dizzy. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd actually done it. But the operation wasn't over. Now came the hard part, making sure the evidence reached the right people, the ones who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Marcus had contacts in the FBI, agents who'd been trying to build a case against Vincent Romano for years. The evidence Isabella had collected would give them everything they needed. They met at a parking garage in Jersey City that evening, the exchange quick and efficient. Marcus handed off the envelope to a grim-faced federal agent who immediately called in a team. Warrants would be issued within hours. Vincent Romano's empire would come crashing down by morning. "You two need to disappear," Marcus said, looking between Adrian and Isabella. "Even with Romano going down, he's got loyal people who'll come looking for revenge. I've got identities ready for you, tickets to Vancouver. You can start fresh there." Fresh start. New identities. A life beyond the shadows. It's what they'd been fighting for, what all this risk had been about. But as Adrian looked at Isabella, saw the exhaustion and relief and hope in her face, he realized that the destination mattered less than who he was traveling with. "Thank you," Isabella said to Marcus, and there were tears in her eyes, "for helping us, for giving me a chance to do the right thing." Marcus smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "Thank you for reminding an old cynic that some people are still worth saving. Now get out of here before I get sentimental." They drove toward Canada that night, leaving behind a city that was about to erupt in chaos. By morning, the news would break. Massive arrests, corruption exposed, one of New York's most powerful crime families dismantled. Isabella Romano, previously thought dead, would be revealed as the key witness, protected now by federal marshals and a growing public sympathy for the daughter who'd taken down her own father's criminal empire. But Isabella and Adrian wouldn't see any of it. They'd be far away, starting the slow process of building something neither of them had ever really had: a normal life. The cabin in rural British Columbia was exactly what they needed. Isolated, peaceful, surrounded by mountains that touched a sky so clear it hurt to look at. They'd been there for 3 weeks, living under new names, learning how to exist in a world that didn't run on fear and violence. Adrian had started volunteering at the local clinic, using his medical skills to help people who couldn't afford proper health care. Isabella had found work at a small art gallery, finally able to pursue her passion without her father's shadow looming over everything. They were building something real, something that belonged only to them. But the past, Adrian was learning, didn't let go easily. It started with small things. A car that seemed to circle their property too many times. A stranger in town asking questions about newcomers. Adrian told himself he was being paranoid, that they'd covered their tracks too well. Marcus had assured them the identities were bulletproof. Then came the phone call that shattered their peace. Adrian answered on a Tuesday morning, expecting one of his patients from the clinic. Instead, he heard a voice he'd hoped never to hear again, cold, controlled, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Dr. Cole, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Vincent Romano. Somehow, impossibly, he'd found them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Adrian said, his free hand already moving to where he kept the gun Marcus had given them. Isabella looked up from her book, her face draining of color as she read the situation in his expression. "Don't insult my intelligence," Romano continued. "Did you really think putting me in federal custody would end this? I have resources you can't imagine, Doctor. Lawyers, judges, politicians in my pocket. This is temporary. But what you did, stealing my daughter, turning her against me, destroying my life's work, that's permanent. And permanent problems require permanent solutions. If you hurt us, you'll only add to the evidence against you," Adrian said, trying to keep his voice steady even as fear closed around his throat. Romano laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Evidence? Do you think I care about evidence at this point? My empire is gone, my reputation destroyed, my own daughter responsible for my downfall. I have nothing left to protect, Doctor, which makes me very, very dangerous." The line went dead. Adrian stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, before Isabella's voice broke through. "How did he find us?" "I don't know," Adrian admitted, moving to the window to scan the tree line. "But we need to move, now." They had a go-bag ready, always ready, because some habits from the underground never died. But as Adrian reached for it, he realized something that made him stop. They could run again, could spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, changing names and cities every time danger found them. Or they could do something neither of them had ever really done before, stand and fight for the life they'd built. "No," he said, setting down the bag. "We're not running." Isabella looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Adrian, that was my father. He found us. We have to hide forever." Adrian turned to face her. "Live in fear. That's not living, Isabella. That's just survival. And I didn't risk everything to save you just so we could spend our lives being afraid." "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though he could see understanding dawning in her eyes. "I'm suggesting we end this, really end it." Adrian pulled out his phone, dialing a number he'd committed to memory. When Marcus answered, Adrian didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Romano found us. He called. I need you to trace the call and give me a location." "Adrian, whatever you're thinking, just do it, Marcus. Please." Nay, while they waited for Marcus to call back, Adrian made a decision that should have terrified him, but instead brought a strange calm. He'd spent 10 years as the healer, saving lives without discrimination, maintaining neutrality as if it were a shield against moral responsibility. But neutrality was just another form of cowardice, and he was done being a coward. Marcus called back within an hour. He's at a private estate in upstate New York, still under house arrest, but the place is a fortress. "Adrian, you can't seriously be thinking about going there." "Give me the address, Marcus. This is suicide. Even if you get past his security, even if you survive, you'll be killing a man under federal protection. That's not something you walk away from." "I'm not planning to kill him," Adrian said quietly. "I'm planning to make sure he can never hurt Isabella again." The drive back to New York took 2 days. They moved carefully, using back roads, staying in motels that didn't ask questions. Isabella tried multiple times to talk him out of this plan, and each time Adrian reminded her of something fundamental. They'd already died once, died to their old lives, their old identities. What they had now was borrowed time, and he'd be damned if he'd spend it running. The estate was exactly as Marcus had described, a sprawling property in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by security that looked more military than private. Romano was under house arrest, but with his resources, the house was more like a gilded prison he controlled completely. "Last chance to back out," Isabella said as they parked a mile away, reviewing the security layout Marcus had provided. "Are you backing out?" Adrian asked. She smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "I've been running from my father my entire life. I think it's time I stopped." They moved in, as sunset painted the sky the color of old blood. Adrian had planned this carefully, using his old contacts in the medical supply world to acquire something special, a drug cocktail that would mimic the symptoms of a massive heart attack. Non-lethal, but convincing enough that even doctors would be fooled until proper tests were run. Getting onto the property was easier than expected. Security was designed to keep Romano in and hostile forces out. But they weren't prepared for two people who had nothing but determination and a medical bag. Adrian used old techniques learned in his underground years, bypassing sensors, moving through blind spots in camera coverage. They found Vincent Romano in his study, surrounded by legal documents, a man who looked older than his years. When they entered, he didn't seem surprised. He simply set down his pen and looked at his daughter with an expression Adrian couldn't quite read. "Isabella," he said, and there was something in his voice, regret perhaps, or the ghost of affection long dead. "I knew you'd come eventually. You were always too stubborn to stay hidden." "This ends tonight," Isabella said, and her voice didn't waver. "No more threats, no more hunting us, no more games." Romano laughed, but it was hollow. "And how do you propose to end this? You going to kill me? Your own father?" "No," Adrian said, stepping forward, "but I'm going to make sure you can't hurt anyone else." He moved fast, years of surgical precision, making his hands swift and sure. The injection was in Romano's arm before the man could react, the drug already flooding his system. Romano gasped, clutching his chest, his face contorting in what appeared to be genuine cardiac distress. "What did you do?" he wheezed, falling to his knees. "I'm making you face a choice," Adrian said coldly. "In about 5 minutes, your security will find you experiencing what looks like a massive heart attack. They'll call an ambulance. You'll be taken to a hospital where you'll be thoroughly examined. And the doctors will find nothing wrong, just a temporary reaction to a drug cocktail that's already leaving your system." Romano looked up at him, confusion and pain warring in his expression. "But here's what you need to understand," Adrian continued, crouching to look the man in the eyes. "I could have killed you. I have the knowledge and the means. I've saved hundreds of lives, but I know just as many ways to end them. I could have given you something that would stop your heart permanently, something that would look completely natural, but I didn't. Do you know why?" Romano couldn't answer, still struggling to breathe. "Because your daughter asked me not to," Adrian said softly. "Because despite everything you've done, trying to have her killed, hunting us across the country, destroying any chance at happiness she might have had, she still doesn't want you dead. She just wants to be free of you." Isabella moved forward, kneeling beside her father. "This is mercy, Father, something you never showed anyone else. I'm giving you your life, but this is the last time we'll ever see each other. If you come after us again, if you send anyone after us, Adrian won't be so kind, and neither will I." As Romano's breathing became more labored, as they heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, Adrian and Isabella slipped back into the shadows. They were gone before security burst through the door, before the ambulance was called, before Vincent Romano could tell anyone what had really happened. But he would remember, and more importantly, he would understand that his daughter had beaten him not through violence, but through the same thing he'd always lacked, mercy tempered with strength. They drove through the night, leaving New York behind once more. This time, though, felt different. They weren't running, they were choosing a life together, choosing to leave the past behind, choosing to believe that redemption was possible, even for ghosts. "Do you think he'll let us go?" Isabella asked as dawn broke over the highway, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Adrian reached over, taking her hand. "I think we showed him something tonight that he's never understood. That real power isn't in forcing people to obey you. It's in choosing not to use power when you have it. That's what makes us different from him, Isabella." We could have killed him, but we didn't, because we're not like him. We never were. They didn't go back to the cabin in British Columbia. That life had been compromised, tainted by Romano's reach. Instead, Marcus arranged new identities, new lives, this time in a small coastal town in Oregon, where the ocean was vast and wild and free. Adrian opened a small clinic, treating fishermen and their families, saving lives that mattered in ways that were simple and profound. Isabella opened an art studio, teaching children to see beauty in a world that often seemed dark. They built a life that was quiet and ordinary and absolutely extraordinary because it was theirs. 6 months later, they learned that Vincent Romano had died of an actual heart attack, brought on by stress and the collapse of everything he'd built. Some of Isabella's relatives reached out, testing to see if she'd return to claim her place in what remained of the family. She sent back a simple message: "I'm already home." A year after that, on a beach at sunset, Adrian asked Isabella to marry him with a ring he'd made himself. Simple, honest, nothing like the expensive jewelry of her old life. When she said yes, tears streaming down her face, he realized that the healer had finally succeeded in his greatest operation. He'd saved not just Isabella's life, but his own. They were married in a small ceremony, with only Marcus and a handful of friends who'd helped them along the way. No family from Isabella's past, no connections to the world they'd left behind. Just a doctor who'd learned to live again, and a woman who'd found freedom in the most unexpected place. Sometimes, late at night, Adrian would wake and watch Isabella sleep, still half afraid this was a dream that would shatter with morning. But then she'd stir, open those dark eyes, smile at him in the darkness, and he'd remember this was real. They were real. They'd fought through hell to find each other, and they'd survived not through violence or power, but through the revolutionary act of choosing to be kind in a cruel world. 2 years after leaving New York, Isabella gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, a name that seemed almost too on the nose, until Adrian held his daughter for the first time and realized that hope was exactly what they'd been fighting for all along. Not just hope for themselves, but hope that the cycle of violence and fear could be broken, that people could change, that love could actually conquer darkness. The underground clinic in Brooklyn was gone, closed by federal investigators. The healer was dead, his legend fading into the kind of urban myth that criminals told each other over drinks. Dr. Adrian Cole, who'd once saved lives without caring, had become simply Adrian. A father, a husband, a small-town doctor who knew every patient by name and actually cared whether they lived or died. And Isabella Romano, the Mafia princess who'd been marked for death by her own father, had become simply Bella, a wife, a mother, an artist who taught children that beauty existed even in dark places, because she'd lived in those dark places and found her way out. On quiet evenings, when hope was asleep and the ocean roared beyond their windows, they'd sit together and talk about their old lives like they were stories about different people, because in many ways, they were. The man who'd been the healer and the woman who'd been a Romano were gone, replaced by 2 people who'd been brave enough to imagine a different ending for their story. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked one night, her head on his shoulder, the firelight playing across their faces. "Everything you gave up? The money, the reputation, the life you'd built?" Adrian thought about it seriously, because she deserved honesty. "I gave up a life that was killing me slowly," he said finally. "What I got instead was actually living. No regrets, not a single one." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and in that moment, Adrian understood something profound. Redemption wasn't about grand gestures or perfect choices. It was about choosing every single day to be a little bit better than you were yesterday, to care when it was easier not to fight for what mattered even when the odds were impossible. He'd been a Mafia doctor who'd saved lives without caring. Then he'd fallen for his patient, and that simple human connection had saved them both. 5 years after leaving New York, a package arrived at their door. Inside was a simple envelope, No return address, containing a news clipping and a handwritten note. The clipping was about the Romano family's complete dissolution, the last of Vincent's loyal lieutenants arrested, the family's remaining legitimate businesses sold off, the era of the Romanos in New York's underworld definitively over. The note was from Marcus. The dragon is dead. The city breathes easier. You two started something bigger than you knew. Sleep well, my friends. Adrian set the clipping aside, looking out the window to where Isabella was teaching Hope to paint in the garden, their daughter's laughter carrying on the wind. The past was truly behind them now, not because they'd run from it, but because they'd faced it and won. That night, as they lay in bed with the sound of the ocean lulling them towards sleep, Isabella whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Adrian asked. "For holding my hand when I was dying," she said, "and for never letting go." Adrian pulled her closer, kissed her forehead. "You're not my patient anymore," he said, echoing words from a lifetime ago. "You're my reason to live, and you always will be." Outside, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, washing away sins and sorrows, carrying them out to a sea vast enough to hold all the darkness they'd escaped. And inside, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances fell asleep holding each other, proof that even in the darkest underworld, love could find a way to survive. The healer was gone. But the man he'd become, father, husband, someone who cared, was everything he'd never known he needed to be. And that, in the end, was the greatest healing of all. Thank you for experiencing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, moved you, or made you believe in second chances, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful narratives. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose a different path, to care when it's easier not to fight for love, even when the odds are impossible. What did you think of Adrian and Isabella's story? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts and reactions mean everything to us. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest healing comes not from saving others, but from allowing ourselves to be saved. Subscribe now and we'll see you in the next story. Tentar novamente. Cláudio pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.